Welcome back to LePodcast, episode 81. You're here with Hoop and Sainey. This is our first installment of the Deep Dive series. This time we're featuring Chris Paul. We're going to take a very intense look at his entire career, starting from when he got drafted all the way up until now, to kind of debunk some narratives on the guy and to give like an objective look at his entire career instead of just feeding you Instagram headlines. And it sounds like very informational and very formal, but we just want to, we do want to inform. But I think it's a lot of fun to figure out, like, it's a great listen. There's a lot of conspiracies that go on in his career. Obviously, like what led to him not winning championships. It's not because he's not good enough. There's worse guys who have won championships, but there are a lot of situational stuff, a lot of just very weird things that haven't happened to other players. So I'm very excited to dive into this after my research.
Oh, 100%. And I think the most exciting thing for me doing these episodes, because this isn't the only one we're doing, of course, because obviously you guys need content for the offseason. We're here to provide it. We understand that, obviously me and Hoop get blessed to be able to put hours and hours into our content and the podcast and whatever it may be that's anything NBA related. And we understand that, the reality is that a lot of viewers don't get to do that, obviously, right? Because we all have responsibilities. So to know that now we can now invest our time into doing this sort of type of research where we can condense a whole player's career within like an hour and kind of go over all of these dumb media narratives and kind of show respect and view players in a different light, so that viewers like you guys obviously can actually understand what went wrong in a player's career. Because you're not gonna, like, some of the stuff we're gonna bring up, I guarantee you guys did not know about unless you're a diehard NBA fan.
I didn't know about it beforehand.
I didn't know about it either, and that's the one thing I can admit that there was a lack of information on my end when it comes to me making different opinions throughout my life as an NBA fan. But I think that after, especially with Chris Paul, like I see Chris Paul at a much higher respect now. Like I see Chris Paul as a much better player than I did before. So shout out to Chris Paul. I'm not going to dive too deep into this. I think we just jump into it so the viewers can start listening. But it's a great listen, and you're going to have a much different perspective on these players that we do over the next few weeks or whatever it may be. And we hope that you learn a thing or two every listen.
Yeah, eventually we're trying to get these players in the stew so they could set their narrative straight. But
it's gonna be fun.
Until then, you'll have to listen to us. So Chris Paul, we're going to split this into three main segments, starting with his early years in New Orleans, where he was drafted, then LA, where he was traded to, and the last one is kind of the latter portion of his career, where he had a stint with Houston, then OKC, and then, as you know, Phoenix. But starting off with New Orleans, the first talking point I have, we'll have two per segment, is Chris Paul versus Deron Williams. This is a heavily debated topic that, like, all the old heads are like, you don't know about D. Will. And I guess I don't, because I was like 4 years old when this was happening. But he was actually in legitimate conversation to be a better point guard than Chris Paul around 2007, 2008. I never knew why, but I dove back in this research, and it's actually very interesting why they were compared so heavily. And it's valid why they were compared so heavily. They were drafted back-to-back in 2005. The whole order for the 05 draft was Andrew Bogut at 1 to Milwaukee, Marvin Williams 2 to Atlanta, then D. Will to Utah, Chris Paul to New Orleans, so the best player of the draft was actually the fourth pick, and Raymond Felton to Charlotte, who was actually in this conversation as well, which I had no idea about. It was the 3-point guards, like back-to-back-to-back. No one knew no one knew who to took where. And I did my due diligence. I found a blog from 05 of people debating over the three to see who would go first. So I want to read a couple of these off because it's very interesting. First, this is from Texan, June 3rd, 2005. This is on a website called Basketball Forum. He says, Felton is the best true point guard out of these guys. Paul isn't even close to being the pass-first true point that Ray is, and Ray is catching up in terms of offensive productivity. He's also the better defender. He will be the best point guard from this draft class. Another guy says, this is Nets Giants, says 1, Paul, 2, Felton, then a large gap, and 3, D. Will. Someone else said, agreed. Last guy says that D. Will, there's a lot more than this, but this guy says D. Will is the better defender out of the three. When you look back at, these guys' careers, Chris Paul made like 9 defensive teams. So it's so funny to look back at like old takes to see how they age, but this was a genuine conversation at the time. Now I want to go over where these guys were drafted, because I think as much as you could just point to Chris Paul and say he's the better talent than D. Will, which I think he is, it's very interesting how situations impact players, because if you look back at these rosters, I'm specifically looking at the 3-point guards. In Utah, where D. Will was going, he had a 24-year-old Carlos Boozer. This is his rookie year, 06. Mehmet Okur was like this stretched big man with a goofy haircut, but he was an all-star one year. He was 26. He had AK-47 at the ripe age of 24 before he got into World of Warcraft. You heard about that, Sainey?
No.
If you look at Andrei Kirilenko's like career, he's really good early. Dude was averaging like 3 blocks as a power forward, like some ridiculous defensive numbers, good all around. I don't know if this contributes to the whole fall off, but I think a big reason as to why he was not steadily increasing is because he was addicted to World of Warcraft. Like the computer.
Respect. I respect that. He went and got a bag, and now he can do whatever he wants in life. Respect.
We have to do something on that, but I didn't go into enough because this is a Chris Paul episode. But I just thought that was hilarious. But at the time, right, AK-47 was a dog, 24 years old. D. Will had a good team with a good coach in Jerry Sloan, like one of the better coaches of all time, who he eventually had beef with, but that's not here nor there. They went 500 his first year from 26 wins the year before. In New Orleans, CP3 was walking into a 25-year-old David West, who, by the way, did nothing before. This was David West's breakout year. You could say that's on David West. Chris Paul, I'm sure helped that. He had a 36-year-old center in PJ Brown, who used to be good defensively. He had other fillers like Desmond Mason, Speedy Claxton. He had a 20-year-old J.R. Smith. He had Chris Anderson on the roster, but he was out for drug abuse, like suspensions. Charlotte with Raymond Felton had Gerald Wallace, Emeka Okafor, who at the time just was coming off a Rookie of the Year, but nothing else. So as far as like the situations go, Chris Paul was maybe not in the best situation. You could say that he would have cooked up in Utah more than D. Will possibly, but he's not in the worst situation. So as far as, blaming the draft goes, because obviously we're going to get into how the NBA literally owned the New Orleans Hornets. Maybe it's not the worst place he could have gone, because what's his name? Raymond Felton played for the Bobcats, and we all know how the Bobcats are. Is there anything you want to add before I move on to another year?
The things I have to add are for Chris Paul and the Hornets are near the end of its Hornets run, especially with the Deron Williams stuff. So I'm going to let you continue, and then I'll chime in once we get like a good chunk of the first few years out the way.
Yeah, so going back, Raymond Felton unfortunately falls out of this conversation. I could keep a minute if you want with the rosters, but he just,
I think a big reason why, this might be a little bit of a hot take. You let me know what you think. But real quick, just to add on, I think the thing that separates Chris Paul and Deron Williams by such a huge gap, all-time talk, is longevity. I think if Chris Paul had a similar longevity to Deron Williams, they're a lot closer than you think.
Oh, I agree, but because I'll get into D. Will.
Longevity obviously is such a big factor. Like, that's not something to downplay, of course. But I'm just saying, like, Deron Williams in his prime, just for the listeners who don't know about Deron Williams, was very freaking good.
Dude, double-digit assists, really good three-point shooter. Like, he was he was
could
there.
handle the ball, bro. Like, there's a lot of amazing Deron Williams handle.
I'm actually doing a D. Will TikTok today.
Dude, do that. He's sick.
I already saw all the crossovers. That double cross is that shook me on my chair.
It is literally, he's insane. Yeah, he's insane. But let's continue.
We're moving over to 08. This is both of these guys' third years in the league. D. Will already got some playoff experience because the team was good. Chris Paul had not been to the playoffs. But in 08, he is second in the league in MVP voting. We're going to get into it. He actually probably could have won it over Kobe. But at this time, D. Will had an older Carlos Boozer, 26, Okur still, AK-47. He had Kyle Korver, 26 years old. He had a 22-year-old Paul Millsap on the bench. So he got a little more help. Chris Paul got Tyson Chandler on the team, Peja Stojakovic at age 30, Morris Peterson, Gennaro Pargo was decent off the bench. But regardless, that's more help than he had in 06. They were the fourth seed overall in the league, 56 wins. They had the number 5 offense in the league, number 7 defense. Compared to the Jazz had the best offense in the league, number 12 in defense. They both lost in the second round. D. Will averaged 21 and 10 on 61% true shooting. I don't want to get too into the numbers, but they perform very similar. D. Will wasn't in the MVP voting. That was never a conversation. It was always Chris Paul versus Kobe. But I could see how it was a genuine conversation when you look at relatively how much help they had, where they went in the playoffs. Like, these are the two top point guards in the league. They deserve to be compared to one another. The separation came later on when D. Will went over to the Nets and things just kind of fell apart. But it is interesting. I know you told me this before, how their head-to-head numbers are. How D. Will kind of, bro, he would always lace up a little extra tight when he'd get on the court versus CP3.
Yeah, I mean, so I have numbers up until the 2012 season, which is where I think D. Will's prime kind of falls off after that. Because I don't really want to compare like a washed-up D. Will to Chris Paul, who had a prime for, you could argue Chris Paul's prime ended after OKC. But I'll say this, he's 13. The record is 13-4 in favor of Deron Williams up until the 2012 season since they've gotten in the league. In head-to-head matchups. Even if you look at after Deron Williams' prime, I'm pretty sure the record is like 17-4 or 17-8. Like, it's still like heavily favored in Deron Williams, of course, which is really which is what I thought was really interesting. Where it's like Deron Williams had like a little bit of a chip on his shoulder every time he played CP, I guess, because there was a point where he won like 7 out of the last 8. Like, there was just like a stretch where Chris Paul could not beat the guy.
Yeah,
I really wish we saw the matchup in the playoffs.
I
really wish we saw the matchup in the playoffs, because that would be an interesting matchup to see them in. But while I do agree it's a team sport, you are correct in that manner. They're still both the number one options on their respective teams, right? And Deron Williams showed that. I'm not saying he's a better number one option. I think Chris Paul is far better than Deron Williams, of course. But Deron Williams, like you said, laced them up a little extra. So you gotta give him the respect on that end in terms of having that chip on his shoulder.
This guy, he saw that dude across the court. It's like, not this guy again. So the question I have for you, kind of to wrap up this like draft and early year talk, last thing I'll say is the Hornets were the 2 seed going into the 08 playoffs, and they lost to the Spurs in 7.
That's impressive.
So that's, bro, the New Orleans Hornets, which is obviously a super small market team that it doesn't even have an owner that they would actually have that good a record. So shout out Chris Paul for being able to lead them. I mean, he led the league in win shares. I mean, we'll get into that with the MVP talk.
Yes.
But you get what I'm talking about. The last thing I have to say is a question, because I want to show you the Milwaukee and Atlanta rosters that 05 draft had. In 06, the Milwaukee Bucks added Andrew Bogut to Michael Redd in his prime. They had a Mo Williams. Head coach was Terry Stotts. I'm saying head coaches because some of them, if you have a good head coach, you're likely to have a more productive team.
It's a huge factor. I agree.
Yeah. Atlanta had Joe Johnson, age 24, Josh Smith, age 20, Al Harrington, who was like a good 18, 19 point per game scorer, 25, a 21-year-old Zaza Pachulia, and Mike Woodson. So out of the teams I shared with you, I think we could easily say that Charlotte was the worst. Shout out to Raymond Felton. I feel bad for the guy. But what team do you think could have possibly given him more success or more to work with than New Orleans? Or do you think that New Orleans was the best spot for Chris Paul?
I'll be honest, I would have rather plug Chris Paul into a situation like Milwaukee, where he has like that Michael Redd. By the way, what you know about Michael Redd, the OG Chris Middleton. But I think I would really like to see
the Middleton though.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I know. But Michael Redd was a bucket. Like, Michael Redd is really like, that's a player to do a deep dive on. But anyway, Chris Paul, I think Milwaukee would have been really interesting, and I really would have liked to see him in Milwaukee. Now, they don't have Andrew Bogut, of course, so they still do lack at the center position. But I feel like back then, it was a lot easier to get away with just having a traditional center that just grabs boards. You didn't really need a center that spaces the floor the way you do now in modern NBA. And I feel like Chris Paul's ability to take a center who's only known to be able to paint sit, he can easily make them a double machine, where it's just 10 points per game, 10 rebounds per game. Chris Paul can easily produce that. We saw it with DeAndre Jordan. So I would have really liked to see him in Milwaukee, because to have such a trigger-happy scorer, and Michael Redd, I guess, is the best way to put him, because Michael Redd was a bucket, right? And to have a guy who playmakes the way Chris Paul playmakes, I think they would have been a great duo. And I think you could literally just chuck any big guy in the paint. You don't need like an Andrew Bogut. At the time, by the way, Andrew Bogut broke his leg, I'm pretty sure. He was a great talent. Like, there was a reason Andrew Bogut went number 1. Don't get it twisted. But I think I would have rathered him on Milwaukee. I think Terry Stotts back then as well. I mean, Terry Stotts kind of had a little bit of a fall off when he started coaching Portland. I think it would have been a better situation than what he had in New Orleans. Because number one, the reason why I don't like New Orleans is because for the first, I think 2 seasons of Chris Paul's career, it was terrible ownership to the point where the NBA had to step in and take over, right? That's the first time we've ever seen something like that. That is the first time imagine the owners were so bad, the NBA was like, get out. And they took over, right? I think that definitely plays a factor. People don't really understand how the way a team treats its players and the respect and the treatment they get can affect how they play on the court. Of course it does. And by the way, remember that point because that's going to come up in the Clippers days. But I think Milwaukee would have been a really dope situation for him to go to if we're looking at the draft.
Yeah, I think it's Atlanta. Joe
Really?
Johnson was 24. So this is someone who was a 6-time All-Star, Joe Johnson. Clutch buckets, someone who can take over the first option role for Chris Paul as he's developing. I don't know if it would turn into a 1A, 1B, but in terms of pure buckets, there was not many better than Joe Johnson. He's an elite closer, something that maybe Chris Paul, there's a stigma on him that he can't close in playoff games or whatever. Like Joe Johnson is that guy as a bucket getter. They also had a 20-year-old Josh Smith. Now, I don't want to say that because Josh Smith, right, had some trouble in Atlanta off court or whatever it was with the chemistry or just not doing the right things or just low basketball IQ, that he would have worked well with Chris Paul in that sense because Chris Paul is like a ultra competitor. But you see a little bit of Blake Griffin in Josh Smith. Dude, he is an ultra athlete. And I got nothing on David West. Dude get busy on down low, a nice midi, or like a Carlos Boozer. But you put him with an upcoming elite scorer and an elite athlete at the four spot, bro, you just give me a shooter. And Zaza was like a decent center who just block shots, grab boards. Like, I love that in Atlanta. I think that would have been so cool, but that's, didn't happen. We're not going to spend too much on hypotheticals, right?
100%. And again, I'm trying to think of the perspective of like, what did that team look like at the time? Not what did they turn into? Because like their progression may hinder if Chris Paul goes there and they put their focus on Chris Paul, right? Because I'm assuming who did Atlanta take? Sorry, if you could.
They took Marvin Williams. Yeah,
they took Marvin Williams, who was a forward, and that kind of helped like that guard. Like there wasn't competition in the backcourt, right? And Josh Smith, I'm assuming, ended up taking Marvin Williams' spot like he didn't pan out. Like, imagine if you get a player that did work out.
Yeah,
how does that affect Atlanta's draft?
How
does that affect Atlanta's draft history, like moving forward, right? With Milwaukee, I'm kind of looking at players who are already like established there, like that Michael Reds, right? Or I'm looking at this roster right now, like Charlie Villanueva, Earl Boykins. These are not players that are going to get affected by Chris Paul. They're already like well into their career, right? At this point, which is the mindset I had. But I can 100% see your perspective. And if you're doing the hypothetical that Atlanta and the players pan out the way they did, then of course, yeah, like Atlanta is a great spot.
We got to move on to the MVP
for sure,
talks because that. The one last thing I'll say, Villanueva was actually a rookie.
He's age 22. You're right. Yeah,
Villanueva was a rookie in Toronto who actually came in second place in the Rookie of the Year voting.
I should say Charlie Bell from Milwaukee then.
Okay,
my apologies. Okay. But let's head on into the 08 MVP discussion. And probably, people don't really bring this up because obviously Kobe Bryant, they don't really want to. I noticed with Kobe, we don't really talk about controversies in terms of like his accomplishments. Nobody really brings up the Kings series where they went on to win a ring. Nobody brings up the 08 MVP.
Well, they should have said he had more, like for Nash. Like it's like, oh, those are Kobe's MVPs that Nash.
Yeah,
took.
like that's why.
But
that's
it's not the other way around. It's not the other way around.
That's my point. So that's why I really like this 08 MVP talk, and I think this is a topic I didn't know much about it. I'll be honest. Beforehand, I didn't know much of anything about it. So I'm really happy I did a lot of in-depth research. I have a lot of cool stats to share with you guys as well. And I'm going to go at this from a non-biased standpoint. So I'm going to create a case for both Kobe and Chris Paul. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you, as someone who does not know anything I'm about to say, who do you think deserved the MVP at the end?
Can you first say the votings, how they actually turned out? Do you have those numbers?
Yeah, so I do actually have Chris Paul, or Kobe won 82 of the final, or of the first place votes, and Chris Paul only had 28. So it was like a huge gap between who should have got MVP. Like the media heavily favored Kobe, 82 to 28 votes. So let's just jump into it. A large part of the reason that people think Chris Paul was robbed was because Kobe had a superior team. Like Kobe did have the better team. That was a major reason where it's like they basically have similar team records. Chris Paul has a much better stat line, I guess. But Kobe had the better team, and they edged out, had a better record, and Kobe ends up winning, in my opinion, because of the idea that Nash won back-to-back and Kobe should have got one of them, right? Here's the thing with Kobe, though. And I will give it to Kobe's credit, 2 of his top 3 players beside him, Andrew Bynum and Pau Gasol, they weren't there for most of the season. Pau Gasol gets traded there at the trade deadline. Andrew Bynum gets injured. Together, Pau Gasol plays 27 games for the Lakers that season. Andrew Bynum only plays 35, right? Kobe Bryant still leads them to the best record in a competitive Western Conference. Although Chris Paul's Hornets were not far behind, 58 wins to 56 wins. Despite Kobe having issues with teammates available, I still believe that Kobe still had more help, right? Because you could just look at the stars of the team and think, oh, Kobe didn't have this player. But Lamar Odom was still a bucket. That Lakers team was still great. In my opinion, Kobe still had the better team. But I do want to jump in, and I don't want to be a stat guy, but I think with the MVP talk, we do have to compare their stats for the season. So I'm going to real quick list off Chris and Kobe's stats. Chris Paul averages 21.1 points per game on 11.6 assists per game, 4 rebounds, 2.7 steals per game, 0.1 blocks per game, and Kobe Bryant at
28.1 blocks per game. You got to block every 10 games.
No. But I'm just listing that because I list Kobe Bryant.
I just thought it was funny.
Yeah. But Kobe Bryant, 28.3 points per game on 5.4 assists, 6.3 rebounds, 1.8 steals per game, and 0.5 blocks per game. Now, Chris Paul is much more efficient, shooting at around 48%, while Kobe is more in like the 46%. And here's where things get interesting. And here's where Chris Paul really dominates. In the advanced stats. Now, Chris Paul had a far better offensive rating, 125 compared to Kobe's 115, and a better defensive rating, 103 compared to Kobe's 105. Here's the funny part. Chris Paul makes a second defensive team. Kobe Bryant goes on to make the first defensive team.
Hold on, because I'm gonna let you rock. But offensive and defensive rating is highly predicated on the people around you.
While I do agree with that, number one, I think that Kobe and the Lakers had a much better roster. And number 2, this is the number 1 options we're talking about. We're not talking about like a role player's rating. We're talking about the guy who's on the court basically at all times.
That's
right?
I'm just putting out a disclaimer to the viewers.
For sure. But when it comes to the first option, I think it's a fair stat to look at.
Sure.
Chris Paul also had a much higher player efficiency rating, had higher win shares, had higher BPM, which is box plus minus, and had a higher VORP, which is value over replacement player. Real quick, I'm going to explain those terms for the viewers that don't understand. PER is the player efficiency rating, and it is a player's per minute productivity. Win share is a measure that is assigned to players based on their offense, defense, and playing time. Box plus minus is based on box score for evaluating basketball players' quality and contribution to the team from play-to-play regression, and value over replacement player calculates the number of points that a player contributed per 100 team possessions above a replacement level player. Chris Paul dominates in all of those advanced stats. And whether you think advanced stats is a nerdy thing and it shouldn't play that much of an effect, when there's this big of a difference, I think it's something that should 100% be brought up. And this is individual. Some of these are individual advanced stats as well. Now, moving forward, taking a more in-depth look at Chris Paul. And again, I'm doing this from a non-biased standpoint, so I'm putting points against and for Chris Paul and Kobe Bryant. I saw a very interesting stat on Reddit from a while ago, and it even had the graph to showcase it. And it was an in-depth look at Chris Paul, and more specifically his assist numbers, because stats don't always paint the picture. It made a comparison to Chris Paul's assist percentages in terms of where his assists come from compared to the league average. And it was actually shown that high quality looks that contribute to more of a high turnover risk, such as layups or passes that come from within the paint, you know what I'm talking about, right? Things that warrant a high turnover risk, like Chris Paul avoided completely. He was well below league average when it comes to getting assists off of layups or anything that warranted like somebody being guarded. And he was well above league average on low quality passes that had a very low turnover risk. In other cases, such as long twos. So a lot of Chris Paul's assists came from passing to players to pull up for a long two, which obviously warrants a less of a turnover risk. And the reason I say that...
So I knew you were going to bring that up. I just looked at David West, right? This is his number one, or this is his number one guy to pass to. Right. I looked at his long two assists or shooting numbers. He took 30% of his shots from 16 feet to the 3-point line. He shot 47% on those. That is a high percentage.
And that is a result of his teammates. And obviously, here's the thing:
they both
you
lead
play
into
smart
each
basketball,
other,
right?
Yes,
right. And the reason I say this because Chris Paul had such a low turnover number. I believe it was about 2 point something. I don't have the specific number with me, but he had such a high assist rate. It was one of the greatest assist to turnover ratios we've seen from a point guard, right, or from a player in general in NBA history. But again, you could look at it from the perspective of the reason he had such like low turnover numbers and high assist numbers is because he never took the risk and his players around him could shoot the ball. And nobody's guarding a long two like that, especially back in the 2000s era, right? A lot of the points came from within the paint, and a lot of players didn't really know how to guard the perimeter. Nowadays, it's much more common. Players know how to adjust to that. But back then, it wasn't really there. You could also argue that Chris Paul was just being a smart player. Why would he go for a high-quality look that warrants a high turnover rate when he knows his guy can hit a long two? So to his credit, I'm going to look at it from that perspective, but I just wanted to throw that out there and kind of let the viewers know the reason that his assist to turnover ratio was so low or so high, like it was such an efficient number, is due to the players around him and guys that are able to hit those kind of shots where it's like easy looks or easy passes to make.
Yeah.
And an assist is an assist, right?
And if I could add one more thing, I don't know how many older folks are sitting here listening to this. Sainey was just very disrespectful. He said they didn't know how to guard the perimeter back then. You didn't say it like that, but it sounded in a way that was like,
but, I mean, it's a lot
y'all
harder.
Were primal. This is what I'm saying. I don't know if it was harder in the sense that people who guard the perimeter weren't as good. What I would say is that there used to be more of a traditional four back there, where there's not many people in the league today that look like David West.
That's my point.
When David West is stretching the floor, then a dude his size has to go out and step out there, which is right. Since he's a good mid-range shooter, people are less likely to adjust to that because they don't have these Trevor Arizas at the four spot, a Jeff Green who's like they're just camping at the corner three right now, right? But like, I get what you're saying. They were not primal back then. But
no,
it was
but like
just,
it was a lot less common.
Yes.
It was a lot less common.
Yes.
Like players like David West were known to play more in the paint, right? Like you wouldn't see a guy like David West pulling up for a long.
So when he goes out there, right, it drags
it's a lot easier to make that play. It's a lot easier to make that pass, right?
Yep.
Anyway, now the reason I list all those points and I kind of bring up things that Chris Paul did, I kind of bring up things that Kobe did, is, in my opinion, it's a close MVP race. I think Chris Paul edges out. Here's where things get interesting, and here's why I think the media played such a crucial role in Kobe Bryant winning. With the votings, Kobe won 82 of the first place votes. Chris Paul's 28. Chris Paul was closer to Kevin Garnett, who won 15 first place votes, than to Kobe, right? So Chris Paul was much closer to being third in the MVP race than he was to being first. That's where I think things get ridiculous, because it didn't come down to the wire. It wasn't a heated debate. Both had fantastic years, but it's as if the media just automatically chose Kobe. Now, was that due to media narratives, right? Like, that's a question to now be asked, because it's like Chris Paul, especially at the time, obviously now we've seen Westbrook, Curry, we've seen these great point guard seasons come up. At the time, that's one of the greatest point guard seasons we've seen in NBA history, right? And you take that Hornets team to a 56-win season, the players that Chris Paul had around him, which, by the way, I don't have the advanced stats, I don't have the in-depth stats here, but if you look at the rosters compared to each other, Kobe Bryant had a far better team, even though Pau Gasol wasn't there for a big chunk and Andrew Bynum was injured. He still had a better team. So that's where the issue arises, and that's where I think that the 08 MVP needs to be looked at in terms of there was a snub, because it seemed that everybody just hopped on this idea that Kobe Bryant deserved it due to previous years. And you could use that same narrative with other MVPs. For example, the Derrick Rose one, they didn't want to give LeBron James another MVP because he just won back-to-back, and then LeBron James goes on to win back-to-back again. Or the Nikola Jokic one, where it's like...
I was going to say, we could get more recent than that.
A lot of media narrative seems to be like, oh, just because he won twice in a row, or just because like he deserves it, or he doesn't deserve it anymore, we should give it to the other guy. Chris Paul was 22, and I don't think there was really any media love for him at the time. And Kobe Bryant coming off back-to-back losses with Steve Nash, it's like, okay, we got to give one to Kobe now, right? But looking at the 08 season, the more I look into it, the more I realize Chris Paul should have been the 08 MVP.
And we got to understand Steve Nash in those two MVP years. The first year where he jumped on the crew, I don't know what the win turnaround was, but it was something ridiculous. It was from maybe a mid-20 to like a high 50, I want to say. Ridiculous turnaround just from someone new running the offense. Chris Paul is obviously doing a similar thing. They just saw that 2 years in a row, and obviously the more marketable player, the better player, because Kobe was better than Steve Nash. He just didn't win the award. So I don't want to say that like this is a Joel Embiid situation, because Joel Embiid, actually went out to the media and said, I deserve the MVP. I don't know if Kobe was doing that. I don't think he cared. I think he just cared about winning, like a chip. Maybe it was a Lakers fans thing. And obviously there's a lot of Lakers fans in the media because it's a super popular team, maybe the most popular. Maybe it was like, oh, geez, here you go, stop crying award for the fans. Is that possible? It's like, oh, Kobe lost 3 years in a row. I'm not
100%.
watching the NBA anymore. This is rigged.
100%. And there wasn't. I don't believe that there was like crazy backing or love towards Chris Paul at the time. He's 22. He's fresh in the league on a small market team. I don't see much media love being shown to him if we're keeping it a stack, right? And I do definitely think the media plays a huge part. I think the MVP in many cases can be looked at as a popularity contest when you have two guys who can be looked at as some sort of competition. And I do think that Kobe Bryant and Chris Paul should have been looked at as like down to the wire MVP race. I'm not saying Chris Paul blew out Kobe Bryant, and I'm not saying Kobe Bryant shouldn't have gotten any recognition for what he did that season. But I think the fact that it literally was over 80% of the votes went to Kobe Bryant, that's where things are a little iffy to me, where it's like, are we really like, is this really what we're doing?
And you know what I'm just thinking about right now? I think about a small market team who has a great player that does something for the city. Damian Lillard. He didn't win an MVP, but he was a great player for a long time. Obviously, Portland has not had much else. They look back at their buzzer beaters as like, thank you, Mr. Lillard. The Hornets are not a team anymore. So there's not a fan base. I mean, they turned into the Pelicans. That there's not a fan base that looks back at Chris Paul who could have had an MVP. Imagine if he had an MVP and this team was still alive. Chris Paul would have been the best thing that ever happened to the franchise. I don't know if Anthony Davis would have. Anthony Davis is not a better player, right? In his tenure, he's not taking the Spurs to 7 games.
No,
or a team
he wasn't. He barely played. He barely played.
I mean, AD was a dog. But I'm saying Chris Paul.
No, he was. But like Chris Paul, yeah,
Chris
Paul was
Paul
that guy.
would have been the best player for a franchise in their history, and maybe he's already that with the Clippers. You could say that, but he on a team where he was the MVP, possibly. I think that changes his narrative entirely. I mean, then we got to look at Kobe. He doesn't have an MVP, bro. Things would change. But if that's all you have, I think we got to get into the part where he does join the Clippers.
I think we kind of touch base on the Clippers then, and then we end off with like a bit of a recap. I don't think we're going to spend too much time on Thunder, Rockets, or Suns because
that
just happened.
A little bit with the injury because
but that's about it. But what do we have? I know a big reason is why didn't they win, but we can start with whatever.
Yeah. So the first part I want to get to is the part where he actually goes to LA.
Yes.
He didn't know he was going to LA for this reason, for the Clippers. He thought he was going to the Lakers. In 2005, the CBA, right, the collective bargaining agreement between the players and the league was signed, and it expired in the 2011-2012 season. A lockout took place. They had Kobe playing in like the Drew League, right? There's a lot of videos from that stuff. The season started around Christmas. It was only 66 games long. Before that season, before it started, rather, the CBA was agreed upon, and the whole premise of it was to make sure that, like, ironic enough, super teams didn't happen, even though the Heat formed, like the Warriors formed. It's hilarious how that went down.
And the Celtics at the time too.
Yeah, like they were trying to prevent that stuff. It's like, oh, it's an even playing ground for the smaller market teams now. Right after that was signed, the trade went through, Chris Paul to the Lakers. The reason why Chris Paul wanted to leave was because he didn't like, well, there's a rumor. I saw he didn't like Monty Williams, which is ironic that he coached him on the Suns, right? Monty Williams was the head coach of the Hornets at the time. He was fed up for whatever reason. Obviously, he's an ultra competitor. Maybe they weren't surrounding him with the right pieces. I don't know. But regardless, he was out. He wanted to go to the Knicks, which is another just adds on to the pain and the suffering. The unlimited pain and suffering. But they agreed on something to the Lakers, which I could read it right here. They would have gotten Chris Paul. This is LA. Houston would have gotten Pau Gasol, and New Orleans would have gotten Lamar Odom, a young Goran Dragic, Luis Scola, Kevin Martin, and a first-round pick. That is like a very even trade. This got vetoed 45 minutes later. This is after Chris Paul was already talking on the phone to Kobe, after people were already, trying to get situated. And only 45 minutes, but that's a lot of time. The Chris Paul, right after it was vetoed, said that he was not reporting to the NOLA camp. Pau Gasol was flustered with the Lakers because he didn't feel like he was wanted. So there's a lot of guys now that have to go back to their teams. It's like, you were about to trade me, dog? Like, what? Which is hilarious. Keep in mind, this is David Stern at the time. This is not Adam Silver. Adam Silver would never do such a thing. But the veto was brought into effect because the NBA was bought out by the Hornets. So the Hornets literally were owned by the NBA. They had power over anything they could do. They had the power to veto that trade. They had to bring up a reason why it was vetoed. They just put basketball reasons. But there's a couple theories as to why, Chris Paul was not allowed to go play with Kobe. The first is that the CBA was just signed to give power to small market teams. The second that thing is signed, New Orleans, a small market team, sends Chris Paul to the LA Lakers to play with Kobe Bryant. How does that make the league look? They feel like idiots. Bro, we just did all this work. We came to a great conclusion. These guys are going to have an even playground. Send Chris Paul to the Lakers. That would have been an awful look on Stern, so I understand from that perspective. But the funnier reason is that Dan Gilbert, this is the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, was upset with the trade and wrote Stern a letter, which I actually brought up. He did write a letter, by the way, to
He's done this a lot.
He did it to LeBron when he left Cleveland because he's the owner of a small market team who lost LeBron to Miami. So, right, he's already upset. This is the letter. I don't know if I read the whole thing, but it says, it would be a travesty to allow the Lakers to acquire Chris Paul in the apparent trade being discussed. I cannot remember ever seeing a trade where a team got by far the best player in the trade and saved over $40 million in the process. And it doesn't appear that they would give up any draft picks, which might allow to later make a trade for Dwight Howard. Right? Dwight Howard was eventually a Laker. They were trying to build a Chris Paul, Kobe, Dwight Howard Lakers team, which we were robbed of. When the Lakers got Pau Gasol, they took on tens of millions in the additional salary and luxury tax, and they gave up on a number of prospects, one in Marc Gasol, who may become a max salary player. I just don't see how we can allow this trade to happen. I know the vast majorities of owners feel the same way I do. He called for a vote between the 29 owners since they were technically a part of the NBA, and the NBA owned the Hornets. So he was salty about it, cried to Mr. Stern, and the veto happened one way or another. So he got his way. But isn't that crazy?
I do think that's crazy, and I do think that we were definitely robbed of some legendary moments. I think that I think Kobe has 6, number one. I think Chris Paul has 1, if that trade goes through. I think it's funny how this isn't Dan Gilbert's first instance of complaining. I think it's ridiculous how a team, like, here's the thing. Maybe I'm looking at it from the perspective of after these guys' careers panned out, but looking at it from now, that's a fair trade. Hornets get a lot of young pieces. Kevin Martin was a
lot.
Kevin Martin was a bucket. You guys forget that Goran Dragic was a solid 20 points per game player.
Scola, Lamar Odom before the breakdown.
Lamar Odom before the breakdown. Luis Scola was a great player. You are genuinely getting like a second lineup of players from the jump, and a lot of these guys can start. But like, you're getting solid depth. That's my point. You might not be getting a superstar, but you don't trade a superstar for a superstar when you're trying to rebuild. That's never the case. You get a bunch of assets. You get a bunch of players who can, they might not turn up on a contender, but they'll turn up on your team, and they'll in turn raise their value. We've seen that happen multiple times, right? You know what I'm talking about? And you can now flip that for greater assets. A great example, Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis for Paul George. At the time, it's like, oh, they got fleeced. Look what happened. If anything, you could say the Pacers won that trade because they were able to flip that into Tyrese Halliburton, and Victor Oladipo goes out with an injury, whatever, but they now have a solid future, right? Anyway, my point is, I think it's ridiculous how owners like that can kind of jump in and destroy a whole team's game plan, because the consequence of that is, like you said, players are now frustrated with their situation. The Hornets are now left in a spot where they know they need to get rid of Chris Paul because he's not going to show up, and they just lost the best possible deal they could have. I'm pretty sure that Clippers deal sucked. I'd love for you to go over it. I think.
I'll go over it.
Yeah, go over. I don't remember what the Clippers deal was, but and now Pau Gasol, who you could actually credit to, like, it was in 2010, right? This is after the Lakers go back-to-back. Pau Gasol's like, what the hell, this team doesn't want me. That must be terrible on a player's confidence. And then, maybe not so much for, like, Kevin Martin and Goran Dragic, because they're not really, like, set stars within their franchises, right? So it doesn't, like, Goran Dragic is young. He doesn't really care. I'm not going to speak for these players, but I'm just speaking from, like, a outside perspective. I think that's ridiculous. And and you can see why that doesn't happen anymore, because they saw the consequence of their actions by letting Dan Gilbert decide, a team's financial decisions.
It was hilarious because I was looking through like the initial player reactions when it got vetoed, and it was like Chris Paul off his BlackBerry just saying "wow," period. That would have been a time. Like knowing what we know now with how the media is, it would be so fun to just like live in that world for a couple days to see how it went. But the actual Clippers trade that went down, right? This is after the veto. Chris Paul still wanted out of New Orleans. He wasn't going to report to camp. The actual trade that went down was LA gets Chris Paul 2 second-round picks. New Orleans gets Eric Gordon, who was supposed to be a developing star. I think he averaged like 20 a game early on for the Clippers. Al-Farouq Aminu, Chris Kaman, and a first-round pick. Worse than the initial deal. They got fleeced even more.
Their best player in that deal was Eric Gordon, right?
Yep.
That sucks. No, that's such a rude thing to say. Eric Gordon's a great player. No, I don't mean in that sense.
That is
I mean
crazy.
in the sense of like New Orleans was trying to rebuild, and none of those guys contributed. Like they ended up eventually like getting Anthony Davis, which really kickstarted their franchise again, right? But like from what they got from their superstar and Chris Paul, that sucks. And I think you can agree, right? That's not crazy to say.
Yeah. I just would have said it wasn't as good as getting like.
It wasn't as good. No, but like it sucks that they lost out to get that.
Oh, you said they got Eric Gordon? That sucks.
No, you know what I mean. I love EG, man. You know what I mean. But that's like I don't know how much like.
I got one more thing to do.
Yeah.
We got to get through the question of this topic. The last trade I'll bring up is the possible one that would have happened with the Knicks. This is a mock off like Bleacher Report, so this could have been just some random, right? I have no idea. But it would have been something like this. New York gets Chris Paul to pair with Melo and Amari Stoudemire. This is Amari before he broke down with injury. LA would have gotten Raymond Felton. Believe it or not, Raymond Felton, right? Going right back for Chris Paul. Wilson Chandler, who was very good in that 2010 season. And Eddie Curry, like, was not playing, but he was on an expiring $11 million deal. So that would open up cap space, probably give him a couple picks or role players or whatever. That would have been the trade. The question I have for you is looking at these three tandems, the one that actually happened and the two that could have happened, I want you to rank them. It might be easy who's number one. The Lakers
are number one.
Hold up. But I'm also saying we're assuming they're getting Dwight. So it would have been Chris Paul, Kobe, Dwight. Then the Knicks, it's CP3, Melo, Amari. If we want to go into like technical terms, then we could say, oh, the Knicks would have still got Tyson Chandler, they had Shump, they had JR. Like we could say maybe that was I don't know if it's a better team than the Lakers. But then the Clippers have the team with Blake Griffin, the first overall pick, which is also very interesting how his career played out. And DeAndre Jordan. I don't even want to think about that Knicks team. They would have been so cold with a good point guard. Oh my gosh.
I would rank them in terms of Lakers would be number one by far. And I think Knicks and Clippers are close. But I'm going to edge out the Knicks being number two. The reason I say that is because obviously we've seen Amari Stoudemire work well with a point guard like Chris Paul.
Had he stayed healthy, it would have been crazy.
Like it would have been 30. But at the same time, I also want to think like, okay, Melo is a little bit of a ball-dominant player. He's an ISO player. Like you do need the ball in his hands, and he is going to be that number one option. But we've never seen Melo on a team like that in his prime where he has a point guard. Like how many great guards did Melo play with before Damian Lillard?
He had, Chauncey Billups was really good, but he was like the man battling Kobe in Denver. So I would like to think that he would have like, he played with AI too for a year.
And Chauncey Billups, to be fair, and AI, they're like score first guys, are they not? Like I'm talking about like a traditional point guard like Chris Paul, where it's like
it would have been really cool.
Playmaking guard like Chris Paul, like where Melo isn't just forced into an ISO. The
dynamic would have been totally different.
Would have been different, right? Which is why I'm going to rank the Knicks too, because I don't know how that will play out.
Exactly.
We've never seen Melo with a guy like that. With Kobe Bryant and Dwight Howard, you have a superstar center who we know Chris Paul would have excelled to another level. And then Kobe Bryant's Kobe Bryant, right? But I'm going to say Lakers 1, Knicks 2, Clippers 3, but Clippers and Knicks are close.
I'll say the same thing. I think there's a little more of a gap with just because I'm assuming the Knicks have more
space.
Fair enough. Also, I mean, if we're thinking just in theory, like Blake Griffin with Chris Paul should have been so much better than it was. But that
So
leads
much.
us into our next topic. Why
I want to talk
did
about.
Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, and DeAndre Jordan not work out?
I'm gonna say this with the Clippers, and I know we're already at the 45th minute mark, so I'm not gonna like rush like crazy, but I am gonna go over like the major points here. I think there's two major factors to why the Clippers did not win, and I think that their last chance of winning was in 2015. I think after 2015, you can't blame them for not working because that's obviously where the Warriors took over, and then the Spurs were really great as well, and then the Rockets had that run, right? So it was a very competitive Western Conference. And the Thunder as well. Oh my God, and the Thunder, right? Like that's an insane conference to deal with. The Clippers were obviously still a great team, but I'm not going to really discredit them for their failures past 2015. But before 2015, right, like there were years that they should have won. Here are the two major factors, in my opinion, why it didn't work. Injuries. I'm going to go over their injury timeline in each year through the playoffs, and I want you to tell me like what you think. Like, did you know about any of this, right? So the 2012 playoffs, Chris Paul goes down with a groin injury. Blake Griffin sprained his left knee. Caron Butler has a broken hand, right?
Do you have a list of what the roster looked like when he first stepped in? I could pull that
No,
up
I
if
don't.
you want. I can do that.
No, I do not. But I'm just talking about the major stars.
Yeah,
You're not going to win
yeah.
without your major stars. And
Yep.
and I'll talk about the Clippers roster in a bit, but I'm just talking about like mainly the stars injury because this is very like you'll see. So 2012, Chris Paul groin injury, Blake Griffin sprained knee, right? I'm not going to talk about Caron Butler, whatever. 2013 playoffs, Blake Griffin high ankle sprain, played limited minutes of Game 5 and Game 6 of the first round. Like he couldn't play, right? 2014, there was no injuries, but this is when the Donald Sterling controversy was happening. Do you remember the Donald Sterling controversy? This is when they had that really
vaguely.
racist owner and players didn't even want to play on that team. Now, Chris Paul says that it didn't affect him, but number one, Chris Paul's a very competitive guy. I'm sure he just didn't want to make an excuse. Number two, that doesn't mean it didn't affect other players on the team, right? Because obviously that whole Donald Sterling thing, that was a wild time of the NBA. If you don't know about that, I'm not going to go too much in depth here because we don't have a lot of time. Look up Donald Sterling and what he did with the Clippers. 2015, Chris Paul had hamstring issues, missing Game 1 and 2 of the Houston series, and they blow a 3-1 lead, right? Game 2016, Chris Paul breaks his hand, Blake Griffin injures his quad in the same series. 2017, their last year together, Blake Griffin suffers a toe injury in Game 3. He's out for the rest of the series. That's the Utah series.
Gordon Hayward knocked him out.
That's the but Blake Griffin's out for the basically more than half the series because he breaks his toe.
Hey, that Utah team is so
injury,
underrated. Joe Johnson.
There is a major injury from one or both of their two stars in Chris Paul and Blake Griffin, and every single season they played together but 2014. And the 1 year they were healthy, it was the Donald Sterling controversy, right? So there is a major thing that's affecting that team on the court every single season. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm just here to state facts. Again, I'm not biased. But the second reason I think it didn't work, and there's a lot of backing to this. I know if you guys are fans of JJ Redick's pod, he's talked about this with Jamal Crawford. If you look at like different articles through Clippers players, I mean, they're good now, but back then there was some feud, there was beef. The team chemistry was terrible. Right? It was reported that they had terrible team chemistry, and especially towards the end, they hated each other. And that does not help, especially when you're in a very strong Western Conference era. Again, like the Houston, the Spurs, the Thunder, Memphis. Memphis Grizzlies were amazing back then too. The Warriors, right? When you have little issues like that, that's not a great sign. Now, here's my third reason, and not as strong as the first two, but it's still something to look at. Doc Rivers and the GM of the Clippers created a terrible roster around that Clippers team. They had terrible bench depth. They never had a solid small forward, which you do need in today's game. They could not defend wing players for their life, and they would eventually, that would lead to them running their starters into the ground, which could be a factor as to why Blake Griffin and Chris Paul were always constantly getting injured. They did not leave the court. Their depth was terrible. Your main piece off the bench is a guy who's not known to play winning basketball, and that's Jamal Crawford. And respect to Jamal Crawford, but he's a very inefficient scorer, and that's your best piece coming off the bench.
Can I give you a couple names?
Yes, please.
So this is 2014. This was like the Blake Griffin MVP voting year. They had the top three guys, obviously the two bigs and
don't name
CP.
the top three guys. Name the depths.
They had Jamal Crawford, age 33. JJ Redick, solid.
He's starter.
Matt Barnes, age 33. Darren Collison has always been a dog. Jared Dudley, age 28. Shout out Jared Dudley. Danny Granger, age 30. This is when he was already way past himself.
This was way out of his prime. This is when he left the Pacers and he was like, I'm not going to call him trash, but he wasn't good.
Willie Green, who I think is known more as a coach than a player. Shout out Willie Green, though. Big baby, Glenn Davis. A 35-year-old Steven Jackson. 37-year-old Antoine Jameson. 34-year-old Hito Turkoglu. 22-year-old Reggie Bullock, right? Not a lot of, for a team that's supposed to be very competitive, not a lot of guys at competitive ages. And the rest, they had Sasha Vujacic for 2 games. Shall I fast forward to the 2016 season where they had a supposed super team?
And name the ages, please, because it's going to look a lot.
Well, this was, Paul Pierce was 38, dog. And he started 38 games as the small forward. You talk about small forward not being a priority.
You thought you was Kobe? They don't love you like that.
You thought you were getting a retirement tour? Jeff Green, at the age of 29, who has just always been solid. He didn't play a lot, though. He played 27 games that season. Austin Rivers, 23.
He got traded there halfway through, and he was just like implemented in the system.
Wes Johnson, James Harden broke him. Luke Mbamute, who started 61 games at the small forward spot. Lance Stevenson. Josh Smith, age 30, played 32 games.
Pablo, don't say age 30 like Josh Smith was like that at age 30.
No, I know.
That's why I say he only played 32 players, by the way, it's not like this era where you could be like Curry 35 and you're still putting up numbers. These were not.
Pablo Prigioni, age 38.
Knicks GOAT, though. That's
as far as I'm going.
No, you can see the point as to their depth sucks. And they run their starters in the ground, and every year when their stars go out in injury, who's going to play? Who's going to play?
Maurice Spates in 2017.
Yeah, like
Brandon Bass.
Yeah. No disrespect to these players.
Paul Pierce.
No disrespect to these players, but you see the point to where it's
these ties are hilarious. Raymond Felton played with Chris Paul in this 2017 year. Yeah, blood ties, those point guards.
Yes,
everywhere together.
Like, you see the points, right? Like, the whole premise is that like that Clippers team was not a championship team.
Sorry, I was just staring at the rosters.
That I think the core of Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, and Chris Paul is a championship core. I think you can definitely build a championship team around that. But when the best small forward you give them is Luke Mbamute, no disrespect to him, but that is the best, and you cannot guard wing players for your life. And you have, by the way, it was stated that, and Doc Rivers came out and said this, that after like a few years, like now that he's coaching the Sixers, I believe it was when he was coaching the Sixers, JJ Redick mentioned this. Doc Rivers actually said that he didn't believe in that team. Doc Rivers is on record saying that he did not believe in that Clippers team at the time. So your head coach is a guy who does not believe in you.
He's just going for the paycheck, man.
You see this. You see where that affects
y'all suck,
things, right?
I'll be here.
You see where that affects chemistry. Like, there is definitely some stuff about I would love for them to do a 30 for 30 on Knob City where we get an in-depth look, because there are some things that they're not talking about here. And when your head coach is adding salt to the wound by saying, yeah, I didn't think that we were going to win. What? I don't want to dwell too much on the Clippers because we're already at the 52nd minute. I do want to touch base on like the Thunder, the Raw. Like, this has taken us, like, the first half took us a lot longer than I thought, but those are the major points as to like why I think they didn't win. And I don't think that should be something we look at and blame Chris Paul for being like CP0 or, oh, Chris Paul couldn't win with those Clippers teams. He did have a chance. Realistically, number one, he was barely there for those chances because he would always get injured, or Blake Griffin was always injured. And number two, when you're telling me that his backup is Raymond Felton at 30 or however old he was, right? Like, is that really fair to pin that against Chris Paul, especially at a time where the Warriors did a beautiful job of constructing a great roster? Memphis did a great job. They had great depth. People really underrate those Memphis teams. I don't need to explain the Spurs. The Thunder were great. Houston, that was James Harden's like peak, right? Of course, Chris Paul, that Clippers team was bound to be the worst out of those teams. They never made it past the second round. Of course, they never made it past the second round. Look at their situations.
So he's at a point where, leaving 2017, he's 31 years old. He's been in the league for 10 years, I believe, 9 or 10 years.
Yes.
And not once, maybe 08, was 08 his best chance to win when he was doing the most?
That's crazy to say.
And I mean, we could
not like crazy to say like it's not true, like crazy to say that like that's the situations he was in.
So he really, I mean, if you want to look at the Donald Sterling year, which you could say is like, oh, man up and play ball or whatever. Like, there's only out of the 10 years, right, for a player of his caliber that should have an MVP under his belt, he was in the right circumstances maybe once, maybe twice.
Yeah.
Maybe,
And by the
he
way,
has
I
some
hate
crazy
that
stories
point.
about these other.
I hate when people say,
What?
I hate when people say, "Oh, man up and play basketball," or that idea that like, "Oh, you just have like you get paid millions of dollars," blah blah blah.
Bro,
Like,
people.
imagine how you feel as a minority
Yeah.
playing for a racist owner who's outward like known to be a racist, and he sees you as a product.
Courtside making money off you.
He sees you as a product, and you just have to make him money. That is going to affect you, right? And if you don't think that, then you're ignorant, and you have no understanding of what it would be like to be in that situation. I would literally have done a strike. I wouldn't have played if I was in that position. Like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. But maybe we should
move on. I want to touch base on the Thunder year. Let's move on to the Thunder real quick.
Sorry. Last thing I remember now.
Houston, of course. We forgot Houston.
The last thing I want to say, because I'm leading the first Houston segment. But Blake Griffin as a first overall pick in the year, wasn't it the year with Stephen Harden? He was deservingly a first overall pick, and he played like it in 2014. Injuries and maybe chemistry that Chris Paul got to him. I don't know if you guys remember his 2019 year with the
He was
Pistons.
Great. All-star.
Dude, that Chris Paul Blake Griffin duo had so much more left on the table. So much more. But man, it's
they blew it up
unfortunate.
though because everybody hated each other at the end.
So going into Houston, plays with James Harden for, I don't want to get into it too much, but he played there for 2 seasons. He apparently didn't like James Harden afterwards. Sainey was telling me that
they don't. They don't like each other. Like, they're literally known. Like, Chris Paul has said, like, I don't talk to him. We don't talk. They had a feud. They say they like buried it now, but it's known that they did not like each other. Like, it was known.
Yeah. But the major talking point here is obviously 2018. They're playing a super team in the Golden State Warriors that were destined to win a championship on paper. The Rockets had a ridiculous regular season. Chris Paul, like he does with every other team, just elevates the offense and elevates every part of the team to a point where it seems like you'd think he was LeBron James. We get to a point where the series is 2-2 with Golden State. There's a minute to go. The score was 95-94 Houston. Chris Paul goes down with a hamstring injury, right? This is a common thread in his career where things are going well and then they just fall apart. I know, Sainey, when you came over my house, we were watching that one game against the Thunder where things just like were going well and they fall apart. That was an injury, but like that was just like the stuff that happens to Chris Paul is just like it's I don't want to say it's comical.
It sucks.
But like you would say
sucks.
It's comical, like how crazy it is. He goes down, the Rockets win that game. But they get blown out game 6, and game 7 comes around. Chris Paul's not playing. The Rockets only lost by 9, but they missed 27 straight three-pointers in the game that led to losing game 7 to the Golden State Warriors. This is a super team that they had a chance to dethrone, completely change the narrative around Steph Curry and Kevin Durant. But instead, it just adds to the fire with Harden and Chris Paul. I'll just say it now. I don't know if it's much of a debate. I think they win with Chris Paul because I went back. There's something on YouTube. It has a lot of. It's on ESPN. It's video footage of all 27 missed threes, and I counted on my hands. I counted 5 wide open shots that they missed. Many were Trevor Ariza. Dude was just ice cold, and 5 were decent shots, like a James Harden step back on a smaller defender. That's right. That's like a solid possession. Or like a Steph Curry closing out on a taller shooter like a Trevor Ariza. The rest were bad shots. They were a lot of bad shots. And the thing, if we're saying that 17 of those, which maybe I'm doing it too much, we'll say even if it's 12 of those, Chris Paul as an offensive player gives you better shots. And they only lost by 9. They were up by a lot to start, and those misses, like they stayed afloat for like maybe 7 or 8 of them straight. And then it just eventually slipped away because you got to hit the net at some point. I think they easily win that game with Chris Paul. I don't know if we should open this up for debate, but I think it's crazy.
Here's the thing. I don't know how much we can debate because I 100% agree.
Yeah.
I think that's a no-brainer that Golden State, And the fact that Golden State dominated the Cavaliers also leads me to believe that Houston would have won that series too. Maybe the Cavs like get a game or two, but I think like the Rockets should have had a ring that season. I agree with you, and I think that duo doesn't get split up if they win.
And as far as defense goes, obviously the Warriors are the better defensive team. They have the better defensive personnel to maybe guard LeBron with. But you look at the team, it was JR, George Hill, Kyle Korver.
They weren't doing nothing.
They weren't doing nothing. LeBron would have to average 50 to be in contention. Even
just
if
like how he did 50 the first game. Game 1, he got 50, and that's when he got, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, you're right.
He would have to do that to scratch out a game. But I think the Rockets are NBA champions, which is so crazy that didn't happen. But
so
it's Chris Paul,
we're nearing,
so it happens, right?
We're getting to the
just
near,
the theme.
We're getting to the near end of Chris Paul's career here. We're not really going to touch base on the Suns because that's kind of stuff that's recent and we know about. There's not really a need to dive deep into it. We know why the Suns didn't work. They got spanked by Luka, and they kind of got, like, you know what I mean? Like, and then they lost to the Milwaukee Bucks, who had an amazing team. And Giannis just put on one of the greatest finals performances we've ever seen. We know what happened. But I do want to touch base a little bit on the Thunder real quick before we kind of wrap up this episode. Because heading into the Thunder, obviously, as a Thunder fan, I remember this stuff like it was yesterday. Obviously, we trade Russ to Houston for Chris Paul and a bunch of picks. People look at that trade as a terrible trade for the Thunder because it's like, why are you taking this old, washed Chris Paul? Because at the time, people were calling Chris Paul washed. Like, his career was not... Like, we thought we saw the end of Chris Paul's career. And Chris Paul is actually on record thanking Sam Presti and the Thunder for reviving his career. He said that they gave him the blueprint and they gave him the opportunity to kind of bounce back and make a name for himself again. But heading into that season, the Thunder had a 0.5% chance of making the playoffs. They had guys like Shea, who just got there, his second season in the league, Danilo Gallinari, Steven Adams, Dennis Schroeder, and Chris Paul. That's like the main that's like the main team, right? Like, those are the main pieces. And then obviously surrounded by a bunch of guys like Terrence Ferguson, Lou Dort, whatever. Chris Paul was seen as washed heading into the season, and we were seen to be the 13th seed. Like, we were supposed to be like a high lottery team. We were just going to let Chris Paul run out his contract, I guess. As a Thunder fan, I didn't get the idea. Chris Paul goes on to have a great season, not just Chris Paul, but everybody around him. Now, stat-wise, on the stat sheet, he doesn't really have like an eye-popping season compared to his other seasons, but efficiency-wise, he was hella efficient. He made guys around him look better. Like, Dennis Schroeder looked great. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander really took another step in his game. I know it was his second season, so we're expecting that anyway. But you had guys like Gallinari averaging like 19 a game. Steven Adams looked amazing. Like, Chris Paul just did what Chris Paul usually does, and he makes a team a winning basketball team. They end that season as the 5th seed, tied with the 4th seed. And who's the 4th seed? The Houston Rockets, right? Like, they were literally a head-to-head matchup away from having home court advantage, being given a 0.5% chance to make the playoffs heading into it. Heading into the playoffs, Chris Paul loses in Game 7 on a Lou Dort missed 3 for the win. And that was like the first time we've seen James Harden ever pull off some defense. Like, that was just like a once-in-a-lifetime James Harden defensive play.
And then
it was a rookie Lou Dort.
He jumped a split over the ball, right?
Yeah, and it was a rookie Lou Dort who was taking the shot, right? Like, that's how they lose, off a rookie mistake. That was probably one of the greatest Thunder seasons I've ever seen in my life, what Chris Paul did. I think he really showed people that, number one, he's a great locker room presence, because obviously beforehand there was a lot of media narrative because the Clippers in Houston fall apart and there's issues with Chris Paul and the main guy, right? There's a lot of media narrative that Chris Paul is a bad locker room presence. Chris Paul comes to the Thunder, everybody has nothing but good things. I mean, they still, on their Instagram stories, like Shea and Dennis and Chris, they all still like interact with each other, right? They're all still really good. Chris Paul, to me, needed that Thunder season, and that Thunder season really changed how I viewed Chris Paul as a player, especially. And because of that, I'll always have love for Chris Paul. But you got to remember, he did more in one season with that depleted Thunder team compared to the other Thunder rosters we had than Paul George and Russell Westbrook ever did. Because the farthest PG and Russ got was Game 6 against a rookie Donovan Mitchell, right? Chris Paul takes a Houston Rockets team that has a James Harden averaging like 36 points per game, and Russell Westbrook post All-Star break was looking like the greatest point guard ever, averaging like 32 on like 53% post All-Star. Like, you remember how insane that duo was, right? And they take them to that. Kudos to Chris Paul. That Thunder chapter was the turning point, and which led to him obviously getting traded to the Suns. His first season with the Suns team, who beforehand didn't even make the playoffs yet. Devin Booker's first time in the playoffs was with Chris Paul. Now, you could say that they were bound to make it because they went 8-0 in the bubble, and they just barely missed the playoffs in 2020, sure. But they still haven't, I don't care what you say, they still didn't make the playoffs. Before Chris Paul, they were a fringe lottery team. Like, they were just about to make the playoffs. And you jump to the NBA Finals in Chris Paul's first season? Like, you got to give Chris Paul credit in terms of, like, he is a winning basketball player. Now, 2022, of course, you start to see a decline in Chris Paul because he's getting a little older, and they're up 3-2 on the Mavericks. And the most embarrassing thing...
a little older. This dude is, let me see, 36?
No. But, like, he's, like, older compared to the season before. Like, he's getting older, right? So you're expecting less out of him.
But I'm saying, like, we need, like, all this stuff we're talking about. Like, New Orleans, like, in the 10, 15 minutes we talked about.
This is a long time.
Like,
this is
a couple of years. Dog, that was 6 years.
Yeah.
In LA, 6 years.
Houston
2 years. OKC,
so he
Phoenix,
was in his
3 years.
season. Yeah,
bro,
like,
that's a lot of years.
He has a lot, and the biggest point is that Chris Paul's longevity. Chris Paul does contribute to winning basketball. Just because he doesn't have a ring, his playoff success might be seen a little skewed because of his years in the Clippers. You have to really take an in-depth look and think, like, is it on Chris Paul and his ability to not show up, or is it on the fact that basketball is a team game and you can only do as much as your team allows you to do? And I think that a big reason why we look at Chris Paul and a lot of guys as, like, per se, not winning players is because of LeBron James and what he was able to do with the Cavs, right? People think that everybody's going to turn out like LeBron James. Here's one thing that I really need to stress to fans. LeBron is a once-in-a-lifetime player. You're never going to see a guy like LeBron James take a team like the 2018 Cavs to the finals ever again, or make 10 straight finals appearances. You're never going to see that ever again, ever. And if you compare how, if Chris Paul, by the way, came up in an era where LeBron wasn't doing that stuff, and he played, let's say, 10 years earlier, I think we would look at him at a completely different perspective. Because we look at guys like Steve Nash, we look at guys like Allen Iverson, we look at guys like that, or Tracy McGrady, who don't have a ring, who didn't see much success like that, as so much higher up, right? Because it was in an era where it was normal to not win rings all the time, where it was normal to not be winning basketball games all the time. Go look at those players. No disrespect to them, but Chris Paul has a much better resume if you're going to look at a player being placed on a team to contribute to winning basketball. They just had better situations.
Steve is close, but CP3 gets him in longevity.
No, you know what I mean. No, but like you get what I mean. Like,
I know what you're
Chris
talking
Paul's
about.
career to them, and you won't see a big difference. But if I were to ask you right now, or a casual, who are you taking? Like, it's like an instant answer, almost, right? But at the same time, you got to think, like, guys get placed in different situations in different eras. I feel bad, and I cannot wait to do deep dives on superstars, especially who played in the LeBron James era, and kind of look at their careers, because so many people are getting discredited, and I think a big reason is because of LeBron James. That's how I want to end off the episode.
Hey,
I want to say
you heard it here, bro. LeBron
reason.
Ruined the NBA.
No, he ruined legacies.
He ruined the NBA.
LeBron James ruined players' legacies, other players, because of how good he is.
I agree with the old heads now.
We were spoiled with LeBron James. We were spoiled with LeBron James, because now when players do like what a player should be doing, we will discredit him. Is that not facts?
W glazing.
Is that not facts, though? Is that not facts? Like,
no,
like,
it's
seriously,
all
like,
right. It's just, that's how it is.
It is how it is. And you know what? I can't believe that whole episode just came to the conclusion that LeBron makes Chris Paul look worse, because you guys expect so much more out of players. But I mean, obviously, I'm making jokes, but I think this is a great way to wrap up the episode. I don't know if there's much more to dive deep on Chris Paul, but I think this was awesome. I think I definitely learned a lot on your end. I hope you learned a lot on my end and certain different stats.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is, whether you reach out to us on our Instagram or our Discord, please give us feedback on this episode. We tried to keep it less stats, more conversation and like stories. If you thought even then it was too much stats, let us know. If you want to hear more of like the locker room drama, we could look into stuff like that. So like all of these are going to be kind of formatted in a similar way. So whatever you thought was good and whatever you thought was bad, please let us know in some capacity if you're going to continue to listen, because we don't want to. We're going to listen to you guys, bro. We're not going to listen to ourselves. Like, we're not making this so I could listen.
And this is
back
only
to
our first one. Like, I believe that like the next few deep dives are going to be a lot better than this, because
and
we're still trying to figure it out.
Exactly. So tell us what you like, tell us what you didn't like, but I thought this was really fun.
Yeah. All right. I mean, well, thank you guys again for listening to episode 81. We're not going to reveal the players we do next, because we want it to be some sort of surprise and kind of catch you off guard. But I will say this, it'll be some interesting players that we hope that you'll look at in a new light. And we also hope that after this episode, you kind of see Chris Paul as a little bit more respectful, because I think the CP0 stuff is ridiculous.
It's a was kind of funny for a little bit.
It's a funny meme, but like people really discredit that guy's career.
Yeah.
That's my
Oh,
point.
yeah. No.
Anyway,
he is roasted.
we hope you guys have an amazing day, and thank you again for listening. Peace.